They are coming. Pretend I'm your husband. Don't ask questions. Just smile like you love me. Angela Reyes traced her fingers along the scarlet silk of her gown, but the luxurious fabric felt like a costume, beautiful and suffocating. The Venetian ballroom unfolded before her like a cathedral of secrets, all Murano glass chandeliers and champagne towers reflecting light like fractured diamonds. She didn't belong here among the old money and older bloodlines. But that was the whole point. No one would suspect the woman in the curator's disguise of being anything more than another art expert hired for the evening's authentication. The air tasted of bergamot and power. Somewhere, a pianist played Chopin, the notes threading through conversations held in Italian, French, and the universal language of wealth. Angela's hand drifted to the small device hidden in her clutch. The surveillance bug felt heavier than it should, heavy with 5 years of grief, of rage, of sleepless nights staring at her father's photograph. 5 years. 5 years since they'd found Lorenzo Reyes in that warehouse, a single bullet behind his ear, execution style. 5 years of Deputy Director Kane promising her answers while feeding her carefully curated lies. 5 years of shaping herself into a weapon aimed at one man's heart. The silver bracelet on her wrist caught the light, her father's gift on her 18th birthday. She'd worn it every day since his funeral. A reminder not just of who she'd lost, but of who she'd been before vengeance had rewritten her DNA. She'd rehearsed this moment until it played like muscle memory. Approach the target. Gain his trust. Plant the device. Extract. Clinical. Simple. Survivable. But her pulse hammered against her throat as she scanned the crowd for the man whose name had haunted her dreams and fueled her nightmares. Before we descend into this labyrinth of betrayal and dangerous desire, let me know where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe to join our community of story lovers. And thank you, truly, for helping this channel grow. Your support makes these stories possible. Now steel yourself. You're about to witness the moment Angela's entire world catches fire. Angela found him near the auction display.
Bruno Salvatore.
Even in a room crowded with senators and CEOs, he was a supernova, impossible to ignore. Chiseled features that looked carved from marble, dark hair swept back to reveal a face that belonged on Renaissance frescoes, a tailored black suit that moved with him like a second skin. But it was the ink that marked him. Intricate tattoos crawling up his neck from beneath his collar, disappearing into secrets she'd spent months trying to decode. Monster, she reminded herself. Killer. The man whose empire was built on blood and silence. The man who murdered your father. She moved toward him, each step a calculated risk, her fabricated story balanced on her tongue like poison. The crowd seemed to sense him, conversations quieting as he passed, bodies instinctively creating space, the way the ocean parts for sharks. Angela's breath shallowed as she closed the distance, rehearsing her opening line one final time in her mind. But before she could speak, before she could execute the plan Kane had burned into her brain, Bruno turned. His eyes locked onto hers with a force that stopped her heart. Not the passing glance of a stranger. Not even the appreciative look of a man noticing a beautiful woman. This was recognition. This was inevitability. And beneath it, something that made every instinct scream danger. He moved into her space so quickly she had no time to retreat. Suddenly, he was there, his presence consuming all the oxygen, his cologne a mix of cedar and something darker. Gunpowder. Old leather. History written in violence. The ballroom noise collapsed into white static. His hand found her waist, pulling her against him with a familiarity that should have felt like violation. But his touch wasn't painful, it was protective, commanding yet strangely reverent, as if he'd been holding her for years instead of seconds. Angela's pulse detonated in her ears as his lips brushed her temple, his breath hot and urgent against her skin. "They are coming," he whispered, his voice rough velvet and razor wire. "Pretend I'm your husband. Don't fight me. Just smile like I'm the only man you've ever loved." The shock that flooded Angela's veins wasn't part of any script. Her meticulously constructed plan detonated in her hands.
Who was watching them?
Why would her father's killer protect her? And how did he know her name when she'd never spoken it aloud? Around them, men in expensive suits began to converge, faces too sharp, movements too synchronized, hands reaching toward concealed weapons. And Bruno Salvatore, the man she'd traveled across an ocean to destroy, wrapped his arms around her like a shield and whispered against her hair. "Trust me now. Hate me later. But if you want to live to see morning, you're mine." Angela Reyes had walked into dangerous places before. Museums after dark. Private collections guarded by men with guns and NDAs. Once, a Syrian dig site where the only thing separating her from a militia checkpoint was a forged UNESCO badge and her ability to lie in 3 languages. But nothing had prepared her for the way the Venetian ballroom felt like stepping into a predator's mouth. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her art curator persona settling over her like armor. Smile. Nod. Admire the Caravaggio reproduction hanging near the entrance with just enough expertise to seem legitimate, but not enough to draw prolonged attention. Deputy Director Kane's voice echoed in her skull from their final briefing. "You're invisible. A ghost. In and out before Salvatore even knows you were there." The device in her clutch weighed barely 3 ounces. State-of-the-art surveillance technology, disguised as a lipstick tube. All she had to do was get close enough to plant it in Bruno's jacket pocket during a carefully choreographed collision. Simple. Clean. Then she'd walk out of this palace of marble and lies with the evidence needed to finally prove what she'd known for 5 years, that Bruno Salvatore had ordered her father's execution. Angela accepted a glass of Prosecco from a passing waiter, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. She catalogued the exits like Kane had taught her. East corridor led to the kitchens. West stairs climbed to private galleries. North doors opened onto the canal-side terrace where water taxis waited in the Venetian night. She'd memorized the blueprints until she could navigate this building blind. Around her, Venice's elite played their games of power and pretense. A senator's wife laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. An oil magnate argued about Tintoretto's use of light while his bodyguard stood 3 paces behind, hand resting casually near his hip. Old money waltzed with new corruption, and somewhere in this glittering rod, Bruno Salvatore held court like a Renaissance prince who'd traded a crown for a gun. She'd studied his file until his face haunted her dreams. Born into the Salvatore dynasty. Educated at Oxford. Fluent in 5 languages. Took control of the family at 23 when his father was murdered. Rebuilt the organization into something more sophisticated, more untouchable. The FBI had been trying to bring him down for a decade. They had nothing that would stick. Until now. Until her. Angela's hand drifted to her father's bracelet, spinning it once around her wrist, a nervous habit she'd never broken. Lorenzo Reyes had died because he'd gotten too close to something. Kane had been vague about the details, but the implication was clear. Her father had threatened Salvatore's empire. So Salvatore had eliminated the threat. The memory of her father's funeral crashed through her carefully maintained composure. The closed casket. Her mother's wailing. The way Kane had appeared at the cemetery afterward, his face grave, his offer simple. "Work with us. Help us bring down the man responsible. Give your father's death meaning." She'd said yes before he'd finished speaking. Now, surrounded by Venice's beautiful monsters, Angela searched the crowd for the one face she'd memorized from 100 surveillance photos. She needed to find him. Plant the device. Walk away. Let justice finally arrive after 5 years of waiting. But what Angela didn't know, what Kane had never told her, was that from the moment she'd stepped through the ballroom's gilded doors, she'd been watched, marked, hunted. And Bruno Salvatore was already moving through the crowd toward her, his expression unreadable, his purpose absolute. Angela spotted him through a gap in the crowd, and her entire body went rigid. Bruno Salvatore stood near the Renaissance tapestries, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his posture deceptively relaxed. But she'd studied predators long enough to recognize the coiled tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked movement like a shark sensing blood in water. This was the man. This was the moment. Her fingers closed around the surveillance device in her clutch. She took 3 steps toward him before the world tilted sideways. Bruno's gaze locked onto hers across 30 feet of Venetian marble, and something electric shot down her spine. Not recognition, impossible, they'd never met, but something darker, more certain. His expression shifted, hardened, and then he was moving. Not away from her. Toward her. Fast. Angela's training screamed at her to retreat, but her body refused to obey. He cut through the crowd like a blade through silk, and suddenly he was there, invading her space with an intimacy that stole her breath. His hand found her waist, fingers splaying possessively across the red silk, pulling her against him before she could process what was happening. "They are coming," he breathed against her ear, his voice rough and urgent. "Pretend I'm your husband. Don't fight me. Just smile like I'm the only man you've ever loved." The words hit her like a slap. Angela's mind stuttered, fractured between rage and confusion and the visceral awareness of his body against hers. He smelled like smoke and expensive cologne, and something indefinably dangerous. His grip was iron wrapped in silk, unbreakable but somehow not painful. "What?" she started, but his hand slid to the small of her back, pressing her closer. "Smile," he commanded, his lips curving into something that might have looked affectionate to anyone watching. But his eyes were flint. Men at 3 o'clock. Gray suits. They're not here for the art. Angela's curator training kicked in before her operative instincts could. She followed his gaze subtly, catching sight of 3 men moving through the crowd with too much purpose. Their suits were expensive but wrong, cut to conceal weapons, not impress donors. Their eyes swept the ballroom in systematic patterns. Hunting patterns. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Who are they?" "Not friends of mine." Bruno's hand moved to her face, cupping her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. To anyone watching, they looked like lovers stealing a moment. "And apparently not friends of yours either, Angela Reyes." Ice flooded her veins. He knew her name. Her real name. "How do you?" "Later." He leaned in, his forehead nearly touching hers, and she felt the tension vibrating through him. "Right now we're going to dance our way toward the West Corridor. You're going to laugh at something charming I just said. And then we're going to disappear before those men put bullets in both of us." "I don't understand." "You will." His hand found hers, fingers interlacing with a practiced ease that made her skin burn. "But first you need to trust me for approximately 90 seconds. Think you can manage that, amore mio?" The endearment dripped with dark amusement, but his eyes held something else. Something that looked disturbingly like concern. The men in gray suits were closing in, separating, flanking. Professional. Coordinated. Deadly. Bruno's grip tightened. "Dance with me or die with me. Your choice. But choose now." Angela made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She smiled. Bright and false and absolutely convincing. "Lead the way, husband." His answering grin was savage and beautiful. Then they were moving. Bruno guided Angela through a servants' corridor that smelled of old stone and lemon polish, his hand never leaving the small of her back. Behind them, shouts erupted in the ballroom. Controlled chaos spreading like wildfire. He moved with the certainty of a man who'd memorized every shadow in this building, every escape route, every weakness in centuries-old architecture. They emerged onto a private balcony, overlooking the Grand Canal. Venice spread before them in layers of lamplight and water, beautiful and indifferent to the violence brewing in its ancient heart. Bruno finally released her, putting 3 feet of distance between them, and Angela immediately felt the loss of his warmth. She hated herself for noticing. "Start talking." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "How do you know my name? Why were those men?" "Your father came to me." Bruno cut through her questions like a scalpel through flesh. 3 weeks before he died. "Lorenzo Reyes walked into my home and begged for my protection." The world stopped spinning. Angela's lungs forgot how to process oxygen. "You're lying." "I wish I was." Bruno pulled out his phone, fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. He turned it toward her. Security footage, grainy but unmistakable. Her father, older than she remembered, thinner, walking into what looked like a private study. And across from him, a younger Bruno Salvatore, listening with an intensity that made her chest ache. That's impossible. But even as she said it, she was staring at proof. At her father's face, animated, desperate. Alive. He would have told me. He would have. He was protecting you. Bruno's voice gentled in a way that felt more dangerous than his earlier commands. Lorenzo discovered something about an organization called the Covenant. Financial crimes, human trafficking, political corruption reaching into every level of government. He came to me because he knew I had resources the FBI didn't. Because he knew I owed him a debt. Angela's mind reeled. None of this matched the story Kane had told her. None of this fit the narrative she'd built her entire vendetta around. What debt? 20 years ago, your father could have destroyed my family. He had evidence of weapons trafficking that would have put my father in prison for life. Instead, he buried it. He told my father that some wars weren't worth the collateral damage. Bruno's jaw tightened. I was 7 years old. Lorenzo Reyes saved my childhood. The bracelet on Angela's wrist suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her father had never mentioned the Salvatores. Never hinted at connections to organized crime. But then again, Lorenzo Reyes had been a man of profound secrets, hadn't he? An art dealer who traveled too much, who spoke in careful half-truths, who taught her to read people the way other fathers taught their daughters to read books. If he came to you for help, Angela's voice cracked, then why is he dead? Because I failed him. The words came out raw, stripped of the careful control Bruno had maintained until now. I told Lorenzo I needed time to verify his information, to make sure he wasn't being used. I assigned protection. But someone inside my organization betrayed us. By the time I realized what was happening, your father was already gone. Bruno swiped to another image. A document. Names. Dates. Her father's handwriting in the margins. Deputy Director Vincent Kane. Bruno watched her face as comprehension dawned like poison in her bloodstream. He's been working for the Covenant for 8 years. And he's been using you, Angela. You were never here to gather evidence on me. You were here to be bait. Angela stood in the shower of her hotel suite, letting scalding water pound against her skin until it turned pink. She told Bruno she needed an hour. 1 hour to process the fact that everything she'd believed for 5 years was a carefully constructed lie. 1 hour before she had to decide whether to trust a mafia boss or the government handler who'd promised her justice. The water couldn't wash away the feeling of Bruno's hands on her waist. Couldn't erase the way his voice had cracked when he'd said I failed him. She stepped out, wrapping herself in the hotel's plush robe, and froze. The bathroom mirror had fogged completely, except for 5 words traced in the condensation. You should have run faster. Angela's training snapped into place. She grabbed the closest weapon, a heavy glass bottle of lotion, and spun toward the bedroom. The suite was dark. Too dark. She'd left the lamp on. Movement shifted in the shadows, near her bed. Deputy Director Kane sends his regards. A voice said. Male. American accent. Professional. Angela dove sideways as the suppressed gunshot punched through the space where her head had been. The mirror exploded behind her, glass raining down like deadly snow. She hit the marble floor hard, scrambled behind the bed, mind racing through impossible math. He was between her and the door. She was unarmed except for a bottle of hotel lotion. This was an execution, not an arrest. Another shot splintered the headboard above her. The assassin was moving, circling, taking his time. Nothing personal, he continued, almost conversational. You were a good asset while you lasted, but you've outlived your usefulness. Angela's fingers closed around a shard of mirror glass. Not much of a weapon, but it was something. She could hear him getting closer, his footsteps careful on the marble. 3 feet away. 2 feet. The hotel door exploded inward with a crack of splintering wood. Bruno Salvatore moved through the entrance like violence given form, a gun already raised. He fired twice, controlled, precise, and the assassin crashed backward into the dresser, his weapon clattering across the floor. Bruno was on him in seconds, knee pressed against the man's throat, his gun now aimed at the assassin's forehead. "Who sent you?" Bruno's voice was ice and murder. The assassin laughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "You're too late, Salvatore. They already know she's with you. Kane's cleaning house." Starting with, he convulsed once, foam appearing at the corners of his mouth, eyes rolling back. "Cyanide capsule," Bruno snarled, checking for a pulse that was already fading. "Damn it." Angela emerged from behind the bed, her hands shaking, the glass shard still clutched in her fist. Bruno's eyes swept over her, cataloging damage, checking for injuries with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare despite the thick robe. "You're bleeding," he said, holstering his weapon and crossing to her in 3 strides. She looked down. Her feet were cut from the broken mirror, small trails of blood marking her path across white marble. She hadn't even felt it. Bruno's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression went cold as winter in Siberia.
"Get dressed. Now."
"We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" He turned the phone toward her. Security footage from his villa. Armed men breaching the walls. And in the center of the chaos, directing the assault with casual authority, stood someone she recognized.
Tommaso Salvatore.
Bruno's cousin. His second-in-command. "The kind," Bruno said quietly, "that means everyone you trust is already dead." The private jet cut through alpine darkness at 35,000 feet, and Angela couldn't stop staring at her father's watch. She'd worn it on a chain around her neck for 5 years, a talisman against forgetting. But she'd never noticed the tiny inscription on the back of the case, coordinates so small they were nearly invisible. Bruno had spotted them within seconds of examining it, his jeweler's loupe revealing what grief had hidden.
47.3769 gradi N, 8.5417 gradi e Zurich.
They'd fled Venice in the pre-dawn hours, Bruno's remaining loyal men creating a corridor of violence through Tommaso's ambush. Angela had killed a man, put 2 bullets in his chest when he'd cornered her in the villa's chapel. Her hands had been steady on the trigger. They shook now. "We're descending," Bruno said from across the cabin, his voice pulling her back from the edge of whatever dark place she'd been spiraling toward. He'd barely left her side since the hotel, maintaining a careful distance but always there. A shadow with a gun, and eyes that saw too much. The bank was the kind of institution that catered to people who needed their secrets kept in vaults deeper than graves. No names on the building.
No advertisements.
Just a bronze door set into limestone that had stood since before World War I. The manager who met them in the lobby looked like he'd been carved from the same stone, gray, immovable, utterly discreet. "Account 7734, LR," Angela said, her voice steadier than her pulse. "I'm the designated heir." The manager's expression didn't flicker, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or warning. "This way." The vault was 3 levels down, protected by biometrics and encryption that would have impressed military intelligence. The safety deposit box was smaller than Angela expected, barely larger than a shoebox. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Photographs spilled out first. Men in expensive suits at private meetings. A senator she recognized. A judge. A woman who ran one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in Europe. All of them marked with dates and locations in her father's meticulous handwriting. Beneath the photos, USB drives. Dozens of them. And a letter, sealed with red wax, her name written across the envelope in Lorenzo's distinctive script. Angela's vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think past the roaring in her ears that sounded like her father's voice, like the ocean, like 5 years of grief finally crashing through the dam she'd built to contain it. Bruno's hand touched her shoulder. Gentle. Grounding. "Take your time." She broke the seal with shaking fingers. Her father's words swam on the page. "My dearest Angela, if you're reading this, I've failed to protect you from the truth. The Covenant is not what Kane told you it was. It's older, deeper, more dangerous than you can imagine. I discovered their network while authenticating art for their private collections. I saw things I wasn't meant to see, records hidden in paintings, Ledgers disguised as provenance documents. They launder billions through the art world, my darling. And when I threatened to expose them, they sent Kane to handle me. If you're reading this, trust the Salvatore heir. He's the only one who can finish what I started. His family has been fighting the Covenant for 3 generations. Bruno Salvatore is not your enemy, Angela. He never was. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before. I'm sorry for all the secrets. But know this. Everything I did, every lie I told, was to keep you safe. You were always my masterpiece. With all my love, Papa. The sob tore out of Angela's chest like something dying. 5 years of holding herself together, of building armor from rage and purpose, shattered in an instant. She collapsed forward and Bruno caught her, pulling her against his chest as she wept into expensive Italian wool. His arms wrapped around her like a fortress, and for the first time since they'd pulled her father's body from that warehouse, Angela let herself break. "I've got you," Bruno murmured against her hair. "I've got you, Tesoro. I promise." Bruno's safe house turned out to be a fortress disguised as a vineyard in the Tuscan hills, ancient stone walls wrapped in climbing roses, olive groves stretching toward horizons that looked painted by Renaissance masters. Beautiful. Remote. Defensible. Angela had collapsed into sleep the moment they'd arrived, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion that felt bone deep. She woke to find an old woman sitting in the chair beside her bed. Angela jerked upright, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, but the woman simply raised one elegant hand. "Peace, child. If I wanted you dead, you'd have never woken." Her English was flawless, her accent placing her somewhere between old Florence and older money. She wore black silk that probably cost more than Angela's entire wardrobe, and her eyes, sharp as surgical steel, assessed Angela with the precision of someone who'd spent 80 years reading people's souls. "Donna Violetta," Angela said, recognition clicking into place. Bruno's grandmother. The matriarch who'd held the Salvatore family together through 3 generations of blood and betrayal. "So my grandson told you about me." A smile ghosted across lips painted the color of dried roses.
Good.
"That saves introductions. We need to discuss your future, Angela Reyes. Specifically, why you're going to marry my grandson within the week." Angela's exhaustion evaporated. "Excuse me?" Violetta rose with the grace of someone who'd never been anything less than formidable, crossing to the window where morning light turned her silver hair into a crown. "Your grandfather, Matteo Reyes, was not simply an art dealer. He ran one of the most sophisticated smuggling operations in the Mediterranean. Art, yes, but also information. Weapons when the price was right. He and my husband, Stefano, were rivals for 20 years. Their war nearly destroyed both families." This didn't match anything Angela knew about her family history. Her grandfather had died before she was born, a heart attack, her mother had said. Natural causes. In 1985, they brokered peace, Violetta continued, her reflection ghost-like in the antique glass. The terms were specific. Matteo's firstborn daughter would birth a daughter who would marry Stefano's firstborn son's firstborn son. She turned, her gaze pinning Angela like a butterfly to board. "Your mother, Lucia. You, Angela. And Bruno." The room tilted sideways. "That's insane. You can't just. People aren't property to be traded." "No, they're not." Violetta's voice hardened to granite. "But in our world, blood contracts are more binding than any law your government pretends to uphold." The agreement was witnessed by 7 families. Signed in blood. Sealed with oaths that have kept peace for 40 years. She moved closer, and Angela caught the scent of lavender and gunpowder. "Your father knew. Lorenzo tried to have it dissolved before he died. But the Covenant discovered the contract's existence. They know that if you marry Bruno, you become untouchable under laws older than nations." "Untouchable," Angela repeated, her mind racing through implications. Under Mafia law, a wife cannot be harmed without triggering vendetta that spans continents. The 7 families who witnessed the contract would be honor-bound to protect you. Even the Covenant, with all their power, cannot survive war with the old families. Violetta's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Kane knows this. Lucien Graves knows this. That's why they tried to kill you before Bruno could claim what was promised 40 years ago. Angela stood, her legs unsteady, her world restructuring itself around impossible truths. And if I refuse? Then the Covenant wins. They kill you. They kill Bruno. They erase your father's evidence and continue building their empire on bones and silence. Violetta's expression softened microscopically. But if you marry him, if you honor the contract, you gain an army, protection,
Power.
everything you need to finish what Lorenzo started. The door opened. Bruno stood in the threshold, his face unreadable. Nah, I told you to wait. I'm 83 years old. I don't wait for anyone anymore. Violetta swept past him, pausing to pat his cheek with surprising tenderness. She's stronger than you think. Give her time to process. Then she was gone, leaving Angela and Bruno staring at each other across a room that suddenly felt far too small. How long have you known? Angela asked. Bruno's jaw tightened. Since I was 12. My father told me I'd been promised to a girl I'd never met. And you were just going to what? Wait for me to show up.
No.
He stepped into the room, and she saw exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. I was going to let you live your life. The contract is archaic. Barbaric. I would never have enforced it. His voice dropped. But now it's the only thing keeping you alive. The chapel was older than memory, built into the hillside like a secret carved from stone and faith. Frescoes depicting martyred saints watched from vaulted ceilings, their painted eyes seeming to follow Angela as she walked down an aisle that had witnessed centuries of vows, some born from love, others from necessity, all of them binding. She wore ivory silk that Donna Violetta had produced from somewhere in the villa's vast archives, the fabric whispering against her skin like ghosts.
No ball. No flowers.
Just Angela and the weight of a decision that would either save her life or destroy what remained of her soul. Bruno waited at the altar in a black suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a Caravaggio painting, all shadows and sharp edges, and barely contained power. Behind him, 7 witnesses representing the families who'd sealed the original contract 40 years ago. Old men with older eyes. Women who'd survived wars Angela couldn't imagine. They stood silent as judges, their presence transforming this moment from ceremony into covenant. The priest was ancient, his Latin flowing like water over stones worn smooth by time. But Angela barely heard the prayers. Her entire world had narrowed to Bruno's face, to the way he watched her approach with an expression she couldn't read. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something darker. Something that looked disturbingly like apology. When she reached him, he did something she didn't expect. He knelt. Bruno Salvatore, heir to a dynasty built on blood and respect, a man who commanded rooms with a glance, dropped to one knee before her like a knight from the frescoes above them. He pulled a ring from his pocket, and even in the chapel's dim light, Angela could see it was old. Older than the contract. Older than their tangled histories. This was my mother's, Bruno said, his voice carrying to every corner of that sacred space. Chiara Salvatore wore it for 32 years before cancer took her. She told me before she died that whoever I gave this to should know exactly what they were accepting. His eyes, dark as espresso, sharp as broken glass, held hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. So, let me be clear about what I'm offering. He stood, still holding the ring, and suddenly they were inches apart. Close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his pulse beat in his throat like a war drum. I will give you justice, Bruno said, and it wasn't a proposal. It was a declaration of war. Every name in your father's files. Every member of the Covenant who profited from his death. I will help you burn their empire to ash. Angela's breath caught. I will give you protection. My family. My resources. My life, if necessary. The Covenant will have to go through me to reach you. And I promise you, Tesoro, I am not easy to kill. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the touch electric. And when this is over, When we've exposed Cain and destroyed Graves and given your father the justice he deserves, I will give you a choice. His voice dropped to something raw, something honest. Walk away. Annul this marriage. Return to whatever life you want to build. I won't hold you to vows made under duress. You'll be free. The chapel was so quiet Angela could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the witnesses breathing, could hear centuries of history pressing down on this moment. But until then, Bruno continued, slipping the ring onto her finger where it fit like it had been made for her. You're mine. And I am yours.
In va.
In blood. In whatever comes next. The priest said something in Latin. Bruno's hand cupped her face, with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a claiming. A promise. A vow more binding than any words the priest had spoken. Angela's hands fisted in his jacket, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed that this was insane, that she barely knew him, that marrying her father's. But he wasn't her father's killer. He was her father's choice. When Bruno finally pulled back, his eyes had gone molten. Hello, wife. And despite everything, despite the danger, the lies, the impossible circumstances, Angela smiled. Hello, husband. Something shifted in that moment. Something neither of them would be able to undo. The auction house existed in the kind of gray space where international law went to die, a converted palazzo on a private island 40 minutes from Monaco by speedboat. No names on the guest list. No paper trail. Just an encrypted invitation and the understanding that what happened here could reshape nations. Angela adjusted the diamond choker at her throat. 10 million euros worth of stones that doubled as a surveillance device, courtesy of Bruno's technical specialist. The emerald silk gown she wore cost more than her first apartment, cut low enough to distract but high enough to conceal the knife strapped to her thigh. She looked like she belonged among the oligarchs and arms dealers, the politicians with offshore accounts, and the CEOs who traded in human misery. Bruno's hand rested on the small of her back as they entered the main salon, his touch possessive enough to sell their cover. To the world, they were newlyweds, the notorious Salvatore heir and his American bride, recently married in a ceremony that had sent shockwaves through the underworld. No one questioned their presence here. Bruno's money was as good as anyone's. The auction room was intimate, 30 chairs arranged theater-style, facing a podium where a woman in severe black silk reviewed her notes with the efficiency of someone pricing souls. On the walls, flat screens displayed the evening's offerings. Not art, not antiquities, files, evidence, secrets that could destroy careers, topple governments, trigger wars. Angela's breath caught when she saw Item 17, Reyes investigation, complete file, starting bid. 50 million euros. Her father's case. Everything Cain had supposedly investigated. Everything the Covenant wanted buried. Here. For sale to the highest bidder. Easy. Bruno murmured against her ear, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture that looked affectionate, but was pure strategy. We stick to the plan. Let him come to us. The auction began with smaller items, a senator's offshore accounts, surveillance footage of a judge accepting bribes, medical records that would destroy a presidential campaign. Bidders raised paddles with the casual efficiency of people buying furniture. Lives reduced to line items. Justice sold to whoever could afford it. Then Lucien Graves entered from a side door. Angela had seen his photograph in her father's files, but pictures hadn't captured the cold precision of him. Silver hair swept back from a face that looked carved from ice, a suit that probably cost 6 figures, eyes that assessed the room the way a butcher assessed cuts of meat. He moved directly toward them, his smile sharp enough to draw blood.
Bruno Salvatore.
I heard you'd married. Graves' accent was British boarding school wrapped around something crueler. How unexpected. And how convenient that you'd bring Lorenzo Reyes' daughter to my auction. Every muscle in Angela's body coiled for violence, but Bruno's hand tightened on her waist, a warning. They needed him talking. Needed him confident. Needed him to confirm what they already suspected. Convenience had nothing to do with it, Bruno said evenly. Angela wanted to see where her father's legacy ended up. Graves laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Legacy. What a generous word for treason. He turned his full attention to Angela, and she felt the weight of it like ice water down her spine. Did Kane ever tell you the truth? About how your father died? Why don't you tell me? Angela said, her voice steady despite the rage boiling in her chest. Deputy Director Kane called me personally. Said Lorenzo Reyes had become a liability. Too curious. Too persistent. Asked if I could make it look like organized crime. Graves accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, completely relaxed. I provided the assassin. Kane provided the warehouse location. Your father walked in thinking he was meeting an informant. Instead, he met a bullet. The recording device woven into Angela's diamonds captured every syllable. Kane's been cleaning up messes for the Covenant for years. Graves continued, warming to his subject. Your father was just another loose end. Though I'll admit, using his daughter as bait to draw out Salvatore was inspired. Kane's quite good at his job. Bruno's phone vibrated once. The signal from their team outside that the recording was secure, backed up to 3 separate servers, already being transmitted to contacts in Interpol and the International Criminal Court. Graves' expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes. Realization arriving too late. You're wearing a wire, he said softly. Then louder. Security. The room exploded into chaos. The first gunshot shattered a Venetian mirror behind Angela's head, and then the world became violence and glass and screaming. Bruno moved like a weapon himself, his gun appearing from beneath his jacket as he put 2 rounds into the guard rushing from the left. Angela's training kicked in. She dropped low, grabbed a chair, and swung it into the knees of a man reaching for his holster. The crack of bone was satisfying. East Corridor. Bruno shouted, laying down covering fire as auction guests scattered like panicked birds. Angela ran, her heels abandoned somewhere in the chaos, her dress's silk skirt hiked up so she could move. Behind them, Graves was screaming orders, his veneer of civility stripped away to reveal the monster underneath. They crashed through service doors into a kitchenware staffed up for cover. Bruno grabbed her hand, pulling her through a maze of stainless steel and steam, his grip unbreakable. More gunshots echoed behind them, closer now. Too close. They burst through an exterior door onto a terrace where Mediterranean night air hit Angela's face like a blessing. But they were 3 stories up, and the only way forward was a narrow stone bridge connecting to the palazzo's older wing, original medieval construction that looked like it might collapse under a strong wind, much less 2 people running for their lives. You trust me? Bruno asked, and Angela realized the bridge was their only option. I married you, didn't I? His grin was feral. Good answer. They ran as bullets sparked off stone behind them, as guards poured onto the terrace, as the ancient bridge swayed beneath their feet like something alive. The sky opened up, Mediterranean storms arriving with biblical fury, rain turning the tiles slick and treacherous. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating their escape in stuttering snapshots of desperation. The bridge ended at a rooftop garden gone wild, overgrown olive trees and crumbling urns, terracotta tiles angled sharply toward a 3-story drop to churning sea below. Bruno pulled Angela behind a stone planter as gunfire chewed through the foliage around them. Rain plastered his dark hair to his skull, made his white shirt transparent, turned him into something from a nightmare or a dream. We need to go higher, he said, scanning the roofline. There, the chapel tower. Violetta's extraction team will meet us there. They climbed, using ancient stonework like a ladder, their hands bleeding from rough edges, their bodies pushed past exhaustion into something animal. A bullet grazed Angela's shoulder, white-hot pain lancing through her. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Bruno was ahead of her, reaching back, pulling her up, always there. The chapel was barely more than a shell, walls open to the storm, a stone altar crumbling beneath centuries of weather, frescoes faded to ghost images. But it was shelter. It was sacred space. And when Bruno pulled her into the shadows, when his hands framed her face and his eyes searched hers with something beyond relief, Angela understood. They'd survived. Together. I need to tell you something, Bruno said, rain streaming down his face, blood seeping from a cut above his eye. Before Violetta's team arrives. Before we go back to war.
Bruno?
That vow I made, in the chapel, about giving you a choice when this was over. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, impossibly gentle given the violence they'd just escaped.
Elite.
Angela's breath caught. I can't let you walk away, he continued, his voice raw. I should. You deserve better than a man built from bullets and blood. But I'm too selfish. Too far gone. His forehead touched hers, and she felt him trembling. So I'm asking, not as part of a contract, not a strategy. I'm asking if you'll choose this. Choose me, even knowing what I am. The storm raged around them. Below, guards searched the grounds with spotlights. Behind them, sirens wailed as Interpol descended on the island. But in this moment, in this ruined chapel beneath a furious sky, Angela Reyes made the most important choice of her life. She kissed him.
Hard.
Desperate. Real. You think I don't know what you are? She said against his lips. You're the man who saved me when you should have let me die. Who honored my father when the world called him a traitor. Who knelt before me and offered war instead of pretty lies. Her hands fisted in his soaked shirt. I choose you, Bruno Salvatore. Not because of some contract signed before we were born. Because you're mine. His answering kiss tasted like rain and blood and salvation. Together, he whispered. Always, she answered. Not because we have to. Because we choose to. Lightning illuminated them. Two figures wrapped around each other in a chapel that had witnessed 1,000 prayers. And somewhere in that moment, Angela stopped being the woman hunting her father's killer. She became the woman who rewrote destiny, claimed her king, and set fire to the world that tried to destroy her. Below them, helicopter blades cut through the storm. Violetta's extraction team, arriving precisely on time. But Angela didn't move. Not yet. Because this moment, this rain-soaked, blood-stained, perfectly imperfect moment, belonged only to them.